Welcome to our section 3 of the course where we're going to be talking about penetration testing. We're going to walk through some of the methodologies that you can use. It's going to be generalized because obviously penetration testing is quite context-based, so you really have to take these tools and apply it to the system that you're using or as well as a specific vulnerability that you're trying to exploit. I'm also going to walk through an example of a cyber attack to kind of understand the phases of an attack so it can really understand, uh, how what you're going to do as an attacker and apply those with your pen testing techniques. And we're going to walk through some tools that can help you along the way to speed things up, maybe find vulnerabilities that you didn't know it was there, and really show how pen testing works hand in hand with the vulnerability assessment that we did in the previous section. And then of course, once you're finished everything, you're going to report your findings in a way that really describes everything you know about the vulnerability, right? Remember before section 2 was about the what vulnerabilities did you find, and this section is more about the how do we actually exploit the vulnerability, how is it going to impact your system, and that's really what you need to get across in a clear and concise way in these reports. So looking forward to diving in. And welcome to our first video in section 3 of the course where we're going to dive into penetration testing. So up to now we've really learned how to create a successful vulnerability assessment, and that includes using some automation tools for our scanning purposes. And what the tools really help do is identify vulnerabilities that can be difficult to identify, classify them in terms of the CVSS scores, or whether you want maybe just critical, high, medium, low. Really help you understand the impact to your system and give you a lot of information about kind of remediation steps, whether that's patching your software or link you to certain fixes online. And then we also learned how to interpret those results and create this nice detailed report that you can take to upper level management and decide what you want to do in terms of resourcing and effort. But now we want to take that and actually start trying to exploit those vulnerabilities that you found or find new ones. This gets into penetration testing and really understanding how do we actually exploit those vulnerabilities, understand the impact, how far can we actually get into our system, so understanding the depth of a breach, and this is what really encompasses penetration testing. It's really putting our defenses to the test, right, and simulating real world attacks. I want to start this video really going through the different phases of penetration testing. Now I know we talked a little bit about the phases of VAPT itself, but I want to get a little bit deeper into what are the actual phases of penetration testing, and then I'll follow it up too in another video with kind of the phases of an attack. And really you have to kind of understand and both in terms of getting in the mindset of an attacker and then really making sure you're doing efficient penetration testing. So really it starts with intelligence gathering. Really anything you want to start, you should do some form of that. And with penetration testing, you really want to start at the kind of the output of your vulnerability assessment, that report that you generated with all of those vulnerabilities. You want to start looking at and understanding all of them and understanding what should be tested and what should not. And in the next slide, we'll get into that. You might want to do some initial threat modeling. Right, this is highly dependent on the type of system, whether you're, Internet of Things, cloud, mobile. They each have specific threat models that you can follow with that environment. But ultimately, you want to do some form of understanding your threat landscape, and then finally, important part is understanding the public data surrounding specific vulnerabilities that you might find, right? And it's really important to do that because attackers have that same data. So publicly disclosed vulnerabilities will have certain information about the exploit, and so you want to understand how that exploit can affect your system, right? How you use a component is different from somebody else, and so that vulnerability might not impact you as much. And so this is part of penetration testing, is exploiting that vulnerability and understanding how that exploits your system as a whole. And then, of course, the exploitation phase, right? You're going to attempt to breach the system through some identified vulnerability, whether it's through scanning or maybe it was a manual test that you did to really understand, okay, this is a vulnerability maybe specific to my system. I'm doing some sort of custom authentication mechanism that really is not covered by the scanning tools, and this is kind of gets into taking that asset inventory that you created and understanding the vulnerabilities associated to them, whether they're detected by the scanning tool or not, you still have to understand that how this component can be compromised. And then there's the post exploitation phase where you're going to understand how deep into the system you get. Once you've exploited that vulnerability, how far can you get into the system? What data can be collected? And what other systems can you compromise? And we'll get into kind of the phases of attacks where you're kind of doing lateral movement between different components within your system to kind of compromise it further. And this gets into the how important penetration testing is, because it's about understanding that initial attack vector and then exploiting it to farthest possible extent, right? And that can tell you what kind of security mechanisms you can put in place along the way to really protect stop that penetration further. And and then obviously there's the reporting, right? So once you've exploited it as much as you possibly could, you're gonna document it, using a lot of the same detailed reporting as we did with the vulnerability assessment, but be more specific about that vulnerability and how you exploited it. You want to really explain, the different steps that you did, what tools you use, what were the findings of the tools, and really making it clear that the impact to your business or system with that specific vulnerability. So that was a short little video on the different phases of penetration testing. And next, before we actually get into it, I want to cover, how do we actually decide what vulnerability should be pen tested, right? This is a very important and difficult task because it could send you down a rabbit hole. You got to understand the resource implications of it, and so I want to kind of give you tools and techniques for how to take the vulnerability list from the assessment and prioritize what should be tested and how. So yeah, I'll see you next time. Last time we talked about the different phases of pen testing. And in this video, I want to get into, how do we actually choose those vulnerabilities to properly test before we actually get into the specifics of pen testing itself. It's really about allocating the right resources to penetration testing. You want to be strategic and impactful with the tests or the exploits that you're doing to really help prioritize your security posture, combined with resources, and that's always the difficult task of security professionals. Is the amount you can do is effectively almost endless, and so you have to really be mindful that you don't have unlimited resources or time, and so you want to make the best use of those. So I created a list of criteria that you can kind of use to decide whether a vulnerability is worth testing or not. And I think first, it's important to prioritize your high risk vulnerabilities, right? Because they have the potential to cause the most damage. And you really want to know how easily can these be exploited. So you're going to want to go to each one, understand how to exploit them, and perform the tests yourself. And then as well, understand, does that high impact vulnerability, is it actually high impact to the system itself? Just because I was able to compromise that specific component, it might not have access to, other things. And you really only learn that through penetration testing itself. And so if you think it's a possibility, it should be higher up on the list, really, to make sure and prove that yes, this is a really high risk vulnerability, or maybe it's not, right? And this really decides, like, is it an important asset to the business, right? Like, is this component, will it shut down everything, or will it, allow leaking of personal data, things like that, right? It's the context behind an exploit. The next is the environmental context, and what does that mean? Well, it's really about the internal or external factors on a vulnerability, right? It's kind of outside the technical realm of a vulnerability. Whether maybe it's compliance needs, right? Maybe you have to pen test it, even though there might not be a vulnerability there, right? You want to look at maybe previous breach data. Is it being targeted by attackers to really understand? Okay, no, we need to protect this database more because this is a target for ransomware, things like that, right? And you might have stakeholders concerns. Maybe there's upper management or partners that really want to make sure that this specific vulnerability has been pen tested. So that might influence whether something goes up or down on your prioritized list, right? And you also want to look at, does this one vulnerability affect one component or system or many, right? Because that can increase the criticality of a specific vulnerability. And whether you're affecting third parties, that's something else to consider. Is your component being used by other people, or is it just within your own system? So it could have legal implications, right? If you allow third parties data maybe to be exposed and it's your fault, then that's something that you have to consider and might want to pen test to prove that no, that's not possible, or yes, this is possible, so we need to fix it. And then something else really to think about is, can this vulnerability be easily fixed? It might be extremely problematic. We saw in previous videos, like your SSL, your cryptography random number generation was very weak, so you can't really trust your cryptography. And so the fix for that was just upgrading, your open SSL. And so you might not need to pen test it, right? And that's part of your resource allocation. Another piece to this is the complexity of the exploit. How complex is actually going through the entire exploit. Will deter attackers or things of that nature, right? That's something to think about because it's more complex, you're going to have to allocate more resources to it, and maybe you just can't justify it. So you're doing kind of a cost benefit analysis there. Regulatory requirements, that's something that will always come into play, especially, let's say if you're in the financial district. A great example is the payment card industry, where service providers are actually required to perform pen testing every 6 months. And might not have a vulnerability to pen test against, but you have to actually prove that you've tried to exploit your system, and it's actually quite frequent, and you'll see a lot in the different industries across the board. And then I mentioned this before: is the exploit public? Right? If you look at CVEs, there's generally information about the vulnerability, how it's actually exploited, and that information is also available for attackers. So that's something else to consider about. Okay, that might bring the exploit higher because people know how to actually exploit that vulnerability, versus something that you might detect that only that's something to consider. Now, there are standards and regulations coming that if you find a vulnerability, that you actually have to report it. You look at the Cyber Resilience Act that's coming through the EU, that you have a certain amount of time, I think it's like 24 hours, to actually report your vulnerability, and so that might not be a factor anymore. But it is something to consider regardless. And I think all of this really gets down to, what's your acceptable risk? As with any, security program, you have to have a level of acceptable risk, right? In terms of the resource allocation that you're spending. If you're protecting an asset that's worth $1, you might not want to spend $1 million protecting it. So, there's certain, aspects to, what is your acceptable risk when you're kind of prioritizing testing and the vulnerabilities. So hopefully that helps you a little bit in terms of the criteria that you could use to determine whether you should pen test this vulnerability or not. And next we're going to go walk through the phases of a specific attack, and I'm going to use a famous the fish tank casino attack. If you've read it, it's kind of a fun one. Makes you think of Ocean's 11. But going to use that to walk through. Okay, what are the phases of an attack, and what's the attacker actually thinking and trying to do when they actually get into your system. So last time we talked about how do we actually transition from vulnerability assessment to penetration testing. And how do we actually choose the right vulnerabilities to begin our testing on? It's very important for not wasting resources as well as your time. So we also discussed the different phases of penetration testing, including your initial intelligence gathering, exploitation, post-exploitation, as well as the final report. And so now we want to get into what happens during an attack, trying to get into that mindset of the attacker. And I want to do that by talking about a famous cyber attack, the fish tank that was used to hack a casino. So they basically found a vulnerable IoT device, a smart thermostat, and the vulnerability wasn't disclosed exactly how they do that. It could have been default passwords, software bugs, unpatched software, and then combined with a weak firewall, they were able to use that and access a connected computer, which allowed them to gain access to the kind of whole network, and they were able to move and extract a high roller database. And so we can use this to try and understand the steps of hacking. The first step is your initial reconnaissance. So you're going to be scanning your network, using a lot of the same tools that we would be using in this course, and effectively, they used that and they found an insecure smart thermostat. Now it gets to the exploitation phase where they move from the thermometer to the main controller and then to the broader network, right? So they first made their exploit. They gained control of whatever component they were trying to. In this case, it was the smart thermostat. And then now they're going to move on to lateral movement. So looking around, seeing what is there without causing too much noise, right? They got to make sure that they don't trigger some alarms. Maybe they're using an admin account that they gained access to, so a lot of their actions would seem reasonable. And they're looking for sensitive areas. So whether that's payment systems, employee or customer databases. So in this case, it was that high roller database, the information for people containing and betting lots of money at this casino, and then they extract it. So that gets into the final phase. How do we actually extract this data, right? And they need to be careful because they don't want to trigger alarms. So the goal is as effectively as any theft, get as much data as possible and as quietly as possible. You can use encrypted channels to hide what you're trying to extract. You can split the data into smaller chunks, right? So, often you can put things in place to trigger alarms if gigabytes of data are coming out of your system. So you can split into smaller chunks to not make that trigger. You can time with high traffic or low traffic depending on how manual it is or how automated it is, and effectively they went from the thermometer, sent all the data through the thermometer to the cloud, and then to a server in Finland. And then there's a step after that you want to cover your tracks, right? So you're going to erase logs maybe, or even create false ones to confuse investigators. You can even include malware to obscure them trying to find out what's going on, cause a lot of problems continually, and ultimately take a lot of time to actually find that piece of malware before they actually can do the investigation. And so it's important to think about, okay, what made this possible, right? So the thermometer should have been on the asset inventory. And maybe it was missed, maybe it wasn't there, maybe it was low on the list. A simple IoT device. I'm gonna worry about more critical pieces, right? It's not a critical asset by any means, right? So from like trying to prioritize that component, you understand it is difficult to put it ahead of some other things, but you also need to think about how easy is it to fix. Was it a unpatched software, default password? That's pretty easy to fix, and so that should have factored in the equation. But ultimately, that's what makes this difficult, and I think it's a good attack to show, for that reason. So, we covered the different high-level steps of penetration testing, trying to get into the mind of an attacker, right? We're going to first gather intelligence, then we're going to actually exploit, then we're going to laterally move throughout your system to try and find some sensitive things to extract or components you want to compromise. Maybe you're an industrial IoT, you want to compromise some manufacturing line, whatever, and then finally you're going to try and cover your tracks or get the data out securely, things like that. And next, we're actually going to get into some of the methodologies that we can apply to penetration testing. It's going to have to be generalized because a lot of pen testing is very, focused on a specific vulnerability, as well as in the context of your system to really understand how that vulnerability is exploited. But there's some standard methods to kind of run through, almost like a checklist that you can apply when you're pen testing. And then then you're going to really understand how to exploit it, and then get to the stage where we can actually use the tools and then finally report your findings. So thanks. See you next time. Welcome to our section of the course on getting into the techniques and tools that we actually use within penetration testing. And I'm going to map these to the different phases that we kind of learned from the last video, where we used a fish tank hacking a casino example to show the real phases of attack, get into that mindset of your attackers. And the first two phases here, are generally covered by vulnerability assessment. I'm going to walk through just a review and really understand the context of penetration testing. So the first one is footprinting and reconnaissance. It's a foundational step where we gather as much information as possible about the target without really revealing that we're in the system. So we're not actually directly interacting with the system yet. We're just trying to see, with a typical scan, what information can you get to learn more about the subject. So we can employ tools like Whois for domain registration lookups, DNS queries for network structure analysis, and Nmap is a really great tool for identifying open ports and services. And then there's also Google hacking to find hidden information and maybe sensitive data that's exposed unintentionally. And so this phase is really critical for helping us plan our attack vectors and understand the potential weaknesses that we're going to try and exploit. The next phase is scanning and enumeration. So we're trying to deepen our reconnaissance using targeted scans like Nessus, which we talked about last time, and really we're trying to pinpoint security weaknesses and misconfigurations. So really trying to understand our vulnerability landscape to be able to exploit it. And then here we could also use a tool, Wireshark, which everybody should be able to should use in security testing for packet analysis, being able to capture live data passing through networks, and really, this whole phase is a comprehensive scan providing us a detailed blueprint of our target's security posture, whether that's a component or the system as a whole. What we're really trying to do is map out our attack strategies based on some of the vulnerabilities that we discovered through our vulnerability assessment. Next, we're going to get into, okay, let's gain access and exploit these vulnerabilities. We're going to attempt to really breach our target's defenses, and this is what gets into actual penetration testing. So we might employ things like SQL injection to manipulate queries, cross-site scripting, injecting malicious scripts into web pages, if that's something that we're doing. But I think really we're trying to see, okay, can we get this component to execute code that it wasn't allowed to do? So another one is, buffer overflow is quite common to basically run code that it wasn't intended to do. And you can use tools like Metasploit, Burp Sweep, which are kind of ready to use exploiting tools. And you could also use social engineering attacks here. It's quite important to understand the impact. To maybe divulge credentials or convince a user to execute malware. But in terms of remediation, it's certainly awareness training is one of the biggest things that you can do to protect like 90% of the attacks. And then you could also think about employing some sort of access control on the user systems to make sure you're not installing any malware, things like that. And then there's its own difficulties with that in terms of really restricting productivity, but we won't get into that in this course. But from this course perspective, you want to understand how social engineering can actually impact, let's say, a given component. What happens if a user's credentials are compromised or malware starts running on this specific PC? You should really understand how that can impact your system as a whole. Now, this whole phase, the main objective is really just trying to gain unauthorized access. So taking each specific vulnerability and trying to exploit it in a way that gives you access to something you're not allowed to do or data that you're not allowed to see. And after successfully exploiting vulnerabilities, we're going to get into, okay, let's maintain this access and cover our tracks so that we aren't detected. So you could test the ability to install backdoors, use Trojans to ensure continued access to these compromised systems, right? You want to kind of establish a foothold in your system so that whether you're attacking now or later, you want to understand how well your system can detect. And another thing that they use, and it's really calling it command and control or C2 infrastructure, to kind of create ongoing control. And you want to be able to hide that as an attacker for when you actually exploit it. And so the main idea here is just trying to establish your connection and maintain that connection to an external system for control and data collecting. And at the same time, you want to test the ability to really cover your tracks here. So you might tamper with logs, erase them, or put false logs in there. You can use some rootkits to hide your tools that you're using and artifacts that you leave, and you could also deploy decoys to mislead investigators, as we talked about last time. But really the main purpose here is to test how well the target can detect and respond to ongoing intrusions. So, we're also testing here our incident response procedures. How well can how quickly we can respond to these is very important, and what systems need to be in place to actually detect those. So once we've done that, okay, now there's this post-exploitation phase where we're actually simulating an advanced persistent threat. So gained access for an extended period of time, and you're either manipulating it in a way that is doing things that it's not supposed to do, or you're collecting data over an extended period of time, which is what a lot of malware does. But really, we're testing the ability to extend control within the network with the post-exploitation phase. And this involves maybe escalating privileges to gain access to higher level systems, pivoting through the network to reach other components, and then finally harvesting sensitive data. What data can you actually extract from this system, which really assesses the impact of your breach. And some techniques could include exploiting trust relationships between network devices, so getting in the middle of communicating between devices and trying to manipulate communication between the two, or leveraging one to try and gain access to another. As we saw with the smart thermostat, they were able to take that and gain access to a connected computer, an admin computer realistically, to basically use that to gain leverage on other components. And you're trying to understand what the actual attacker can see. So, this phase is really critical for, providing comprehensive insights into how data protection measures perform under sustained assaults. And it really helps creating that robust detection mechanism that you need to put in place. And so you can't do that unless you really understand the system. So This video covered techniques in a little bit more detail. It gave you some things to look up and kind of understand these techniques. Don't have time to get into every single one because there's just too many. So I'm trying to give an overview for you to go further. And I think that's the goal of this course, is to give you some tools and techniques to start your progress and then really just start testing it, as we'll get into in some other videos of like what tools can we use to actually practice and things of that nature. So next we're going to talk about the types of pen testing you can do, what black and white box texting really means, and what it can actually give you in terms of what type of attacker you're simulating. And then we also get into gray box testing to kind of understand the differences there, and how we can employ different attacking scenarios throughout, using these techniques in different scenarios. What information can we gain? So we ended last time talking about the detailed description of some of the techniques and tools we can use throughout our penetration testing process. So which techniques and tools can be applied to different phases. Now, we wanted to briefly talk about kind of different approaches to penetration testing, and that's black box, white box, and gray box testing to really kind of simulate different scenarios in terms of what the attacker knows. And so, each of these methods offers, unique insights and challenges for different scenarios in your assessments. And it's crucial for anyone really looking to specialize in penetration testing. So if we start with black box testing, where the tester really has no prior knowledge of your system or inner workings of your system. And so you're really simulating an attack from an external hacker who knows nothing about your system other than what they can find out themselves by actively looking at kind of public interfaces. So tools like Nmap for network scanning, Metasploit for crafting different payloads are commonly used here. And black box tests are primarily assess, the external security posture of a system, and it's a valuable approach to kind of understand your visibility. How are you? What are all your weaknesses that are visible to the outside world, and a large portion of attackers fall into this bucket, right? So white box testing, on the other hand, is actually the complete opposite of black box testing, where the tester has full knowledge of your infrastructure, and that includes, access to source code, architecture diagrams, documentation. A good example is, an admin, right? A high-level manager might have access to every single system. And some of the tools that you use with white box testing are static code analyzers. So you're actually looking at the source code to find vulnerabilities within it, maybe debuggers. And so you have this extra elevated permission to gain access to everything and really test the system from the inside. So you're examining the internal security posture, how system components interact, identifying vulnerabilities that could be exploited within. Now, gray box testing, as the color suggests, is the kind of hybrid approach where you have partial knowledge of the internal systems. You might not be an admin, but you could be maybe a lower level employee that might have access to some things, but you can't exploit absolutely everything, right? So it could include architecture overviews, maybe limited access credentials. And so tools like web application scanners, advanced network scanners are used to both, explore both internal and external vulnerabilities. So, using an authenticated scan is an example by bypassing that first security layer. And you saw this as part of the project for Section 2, where we entered in credentials into your network scan. So you're doing this additional scan, passing that, first layer of gaining access to that Metasploitable VM that we used. And really, gray box testing provides a balanced approach where you might have both internal and external security vulnerabilities. And it's maybe more representative of, let's say, an advanced attacker, right? They're doing really well to gain information that's not necessarily publicly known. They might have done a social engineering attack to gain credentials, or they gained some sort of data from somewhere that gave them access to something that you kind of don't assume in a black box test. So really, it's kind of this integration between the two, and throughout your career you'll span kind of both, and you kind of want to do all three. A lot of pen testing is focused on black box, but white box is also extremely important to really understand. Once they get access to your system, what can they do? So this we really basically covered the different types of pen testing: black box, white box, and gray box, and from a complete external hacker to maybe heavily embedded into your organization, that kind of administrator level. And next, I want to get into kind of different testing frameworks, really, really good ones that everybody should know if you're getting into pen testing. And then we'll be able to actually get into using some of these tools. So we're going to focus next on NIST's testing framework as well as OWASP's, and I think the combination of those really gives you an idea of kind of what are the standards surrounding pen testing. Hello, and welcome to our section of the course on the necessary frameworks that you need to understand for penetration testing. Up to this point, we've gone through some of the essential techniques that we can apply in general when we're pen testing a specific vulnerability, and hopefully gave you some techniques for how to apply it, and some of the tools that you could use at different stages of your penetration testing. So I want to now walk through two testing frameworks. One is NIST Special Publication 800-115. And that's great as like a general purpose guideline for how you approach penetration testing. It can give you some great techniques and really standards surrounding it, which is very helpful. And then I want to walk through OWASP's testing framework, and it's specific to web applications, but I think there's some great things we can kind of pull out there that really apply to everything in general. And so let's start with NIST penetration guide. And it's a structured approach. So it's high level, but it really gets you in that right mindset. And it's divided into four main phases. First is planning, so where you're going to scope your testing and objectives, and we could use the criteria that we established in some videos before to really create this scoping and definition phase. Then it gets into discovery, where we're identifying targets and vulnerabilities. So obviously this is part of the vulnerability assessment piece. And then we're going to attack. So the vulnerabilities that you identified, you're going to exploit, and you're assessing the real world impact. And then, of course, reporting, where your findings are documented and recommended for remediations. We've already talked about this, but I highly recommend reading it. Anything from NIST is really great to understand, especially the cybersecurity frameworks that they release. It's gives you a general overview of security that can be applied to various aspects or technologies. And really, a key component of this guide is integrating risk assessments into it. So, as mentioned before, it's a big part of cybersecurity is your risk mitigation and assessment. That's where you get kind of the intersection of the technical cybersecurity piece with the business impact, and trying to assess how much money do I throw at this problem to fix it in such that it doesn't bankrupt me or whatever, right? So it's always that cost benefit analysis that you have to do, and I think this framework really does that well. And you're going to increase threat modeling, business impact. You're trying to kind of integrate all of that into one. Now, OWASP testing framework. This is kind of more detailed, and it's a comprehensive guide that's designed to improve your security of web applications. But as I mentioned before, it could be applied, I think, in general, and it's very detailed, and you're really solving this penetration testing problem by systematic testing. And it's really creating this segmentation within your system to kind of separate what you're actually testing. So what can you test? What components are involved? It's kind of like an asset inventory for your testing, right? It's, you're dividing things into several key areas, starting with basic information gathering, which we've kind of gone through before, and moving through various critical testing stages. So it really starts by categorizing it at a high level in terms of the various testing stages. So authentication, authorization, access and management, and here you're going to be, dealing with identity management, right? How to identify components or users or devices. It's really creating this kind of picture at a high level of the various pieces that you need to test. And then you, of course, finish off with configuration and deployment management. How are you actually configuring these components or identities, and then how are you deploying various, let's say, upgrades, hardware, kind of everything, right? It's your whole management strategy and process that you're trying to secure here through testing. And then it gets deeper, more application specific, where you're dealing with, input validation, error handling, cryptography, whether it's weak or strong, the various libraries that you're using, and then you're going to look at business logic. So, how are things communicating together? How are you achieving kind of the business goals of your application? And then finally, a lot of this is obviously server side, but you also want to test client side. And it's important to kind of separate the two because they're pretty different entry points, right? One's a server environment, and the other one's maybe, a smartphone or web application, whatever, right? So each of these categories focuses on specific vulnerabilities commonly seen in web applications and provides a methodical testing procedure to identify them. And so this OWASP testing guide and various cheat sheets that they have are really valuable resources that OWASP has created for testers. And so it's great to go through kind of everything they have. They've made it, really easy to kind of get into testing by providing all these great guidelines. So this we covered, two crucial testing frameworks, NIST and OWASP, and I think they should be read and understood by anyone wanting to get into penetration testing. And then next, we're actually going to cover a specific example of walking through, okay, we're going to look at input validation. What are the steps that we need to do? What are the tools that we're going to use? It's going to be kind of a more hands-on approach to testing a specific vulnerability type. And then hopefully that gives you an idea of what it can look like in practice for implementing penetration testing.